Welcome back to EconoSphere, where we dive deep into the economic forces shaping our world. Today, we're exploring one of the most controversial and concerning predictions in modern economics, a comprehensive study that suggests our civilization might be heading toward collapse within the next 2 decades. Before you dismiss this as doomsday speculation, consider this. The research we're discussing came from some of the world's most respected institutions, and recent follow-up analysis suggests we might actually be ahead of schedule. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's unpack what could be the most important economic forecast of our lifetime. The foundation of civilization's fragility throughout human history, civilizations have risen and fallen like waves on an eternal shore. The ancient Egyptians built monuments that still inspire awe today, yet their empire eventually crumbled. The Romans conquered most of the known world, only to watch their vast territories slip away over centuries of decline. The Maya developed sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, then mysteriously abandoned their great cities. What's fascinating about these collapses isn't just that they happened, but how they happened. Historians have identified 4 primary categories that typically contribute to civilizational breakdown: political instability, social and cultural decay, environmental degradation, and economic failure. Think of these as the 4 horsemen of societal collapse. Rarely does just one appear alone. Some collapses were swift and dramatic. Pompeii was buried in a matter of hours when Vesuvius erupted. The mighty Aztec Empire, despite its sophisticated military and millions of subjects, fell to Spanish conquistadors in just 93 days. Others were slow burns that took generations to complete the Roman Empire's decline, stretched across 3 centuries, a gradual weakening that few contemporaries probably recognized as terminal decay. Now, here's what makes our current situation both remarkable and potentially precarious. Our modern civilization represents the pinnacle of human achievement. We've created wealth, technology, and living standards that would seem supernatural to previous generations. The device you're likely watching this on connects you to more information than the greatest libraries of the ancient world. You have access to foods from every continent, medicines that can cure diseases that once decimated populations, and transportation that can move you across the globe in less than a day. This unprecedented prosperity has created something unique in human history, a truly global civilization. Unlike empires of the past that were geographically contained, our modern world is interconnected in ways that would boggle the minds of previous generations. A factory shutdown in Taiwan can affect car production in Detroit. A shipping delay in the Suez Canal can impact grocery prices in Nebraska. We've created a system of breathtaking complexity and efficiency. But here's where things get interesting and concerning. While this interconnectedness has generated incredible wealth and stability, it's also created vulnerabilities that past civilizations never faced. Think of it like this. A traditional village was like a sturdy oak tree. It might bend in strong winds, but its deep roots and solid trunk could weather most storms independently. Our modern civilization, by contrast, is more like a Formula One race car. Incredibly fast and powerful, but dependent on precisely calibrated systems working in perfect harmony. Remove one crucial component, and the whole machine can fail catastrophically. This fragility-complexity paradox is at the heart of what researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology discovered when they decided to model the future of human civilization using cutting-edge computer analysis. The birth of World 3 in 1972, a team of researchers embarked on an ambitious project that would become one of the most influential and controversial studies in economic history. They called their work The Limits to Growth, and their goal was deceptively simple: figure out whether humanity's current trajectory was sustainable. What made this study revolutionary wasn't just its conclusions, but its methodology. This was one of the first major economic studies to harness the power of computers for complex systems modeling. Remember, we're talking about an era when computers were room-sized machines with less processing power than your microwave. The idea of modeling the entire global economy digitally was like proposing to map the human genome with a magnifying glass. Ambitious to the point of seeming impossible, the MIT team created something they called World 3, a computer model designed to simulate the global economy and its various interconnected systems. Imagine trying to build a virtual replica of the entire world economy, accounting for everything from population growth in Bangladesh to industrial output in Germany to pollution levels in the Pacific Ocean. The complexity was staggering. But here's what made World 3 special. It didn't just track individual variables in isolation. Instead, it modeled how these different factors influenced each other in real time. Traditional economic analysis often uses the assumption of ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, which is like trying to understand how a watch works by examining each gear separately. World 3 attempted to model the entire mechanism in motion. Consider how population and innovation interact. A larger population means more mouths to feed, more resources consumed, more pressure on the environment. But a larger population also means more potential inventors, more brilliant minds working on solutions, more human creativity applied to problems. Where's the tipping point? When does the burden outweigh the benefits? These are the kinds of complex interactions that World 3 was designed to explore. The researchers focused on tracking 5 critical variables: global population, industrial production capacity, food production, natural resource availability, and pollution levels. Each of these factors influences all the others in ways that can create what economists call feedback loops, self-reinforcing cycles that can spiral either toward stability or toward crisis. To understand feedback loops, think about a microphone placed too close to a speaker. The microphone picks up sound, sends it to the speaker, which amplifies it, creating a louder sound for the microphone to pick up, which gets amplified even more until you get that ear-piercing screech. Economic systems can experience similar cascading effects. For example, consider aging populations in developed countries. As birth rates decline, societies get older. Older populations require more healthcare and social support, placing greater financial burdens on younger workers. These increased costs make it more expensive and stressful to raise families, which further reduces birth rates, which accelerates population aging, which increases costs for the remaining young people. It's an economic feedback loop that can become self-perpetuating. The World 3 model was designed to capture hundreds of these interconnected relationships and project their combined effects into the future. The researchers weren't trying to predict exactly what would happen. They knew that was impossible. Instead, they ran thousands of simulations with different starting assumptions to see what patterns emerged. The scenarios. From hope to catastrophe. Like good scientists, the MIT researchers understood that the future isn't predetermined. Instead of making a single prediction, they explored multiple scenarios by adjusting their model's assumptions and running the simulation repeatedly. Think of it like a weather forecaster running multiple models to predict hurricane paths. No single model is perfect, but patterns across many models can reveal important trends. The researchers were particularly interested in 3 scenarios that seemed to represent the most likely paths forward for human civilization. The first scenario they called the comprehensive technology pathway. This represents perhaps the most optimistic, realistic outcome. A future where human innovation continues accelerating at an unprecedented pace. In this scenario, we develop breakthrough technologies that solve our resource constraints before they become critical. Imagine fusion power providing unlimited clean energy, laboratory-grown food eliminating agricultural limitations, advanced recycling systems that turn waste into valuable resources, and space-based mining making rare materials abundant. In this comprehensive technology scenario, the computer model still predicts significant challenges around 2040, but they're managed rather than catastrophic. Food production does decline due to environmental pressures, but technological innovations compensate. The global population stabilizes not because of famine or crisis, but because wealthier, more urban societies naturally have fewer children. Industrial output peaks and begins declining, but this isn't necessarily bad news. It reflects increased efficiency rather than reduced prosperity. Think of it like the transition from horses to automobiles. Fewer horses were needed for transportation, which looked like decline in the horse industry, but represented progress toward more efficient transportation systems. Similarly, if we develop highly efficient shared autonomous vehicles, we might need to produce far fewer cars while actually improving transportation for everyone. The second scenario the researchers explored was the stabilized world pathway. This represents what might happen if humanity makes deliberate choices to prioritize sustainability over maximum growth. Instead of relying on breakthrough technologies to save us, this scenario assumes we collectively decide to reduce resource consumption, invest heavily in renewable energy, and fundamentally restructure our economic systems to operate within planetary boundaries. In many ways, this stabilized world scenario resembles the comprehensive technology outcome, but it requires more conscious sacrifice. Industrial production is voluntarily reduced before resource constraints force the issue. Economic growth de-emphasizes material consumption in favor of services, education, and quality of life improvements. It's like choosing to drive more slowly to ensure you reach your destination safely, rather than racing ahead and hoping your brakes work when you need them. When the original study was published in 1972, this stabilized world scenario seemed achievable. The researchers believed that with sufficient political will and international cooperation, humanity could transition to sustainable systems without experiencing major disruptions. But then we come to the third scenario, which the researchers grimly labeled business as usual 2. This pathway represents what happens if current trends simply continue without major technological breakthroughs or deliberate policy changes to address resource constraints and environmental degradation. The business-as-usual scenario paints a dark picture. Pollution continues increasing exponentially, while recycling and resource recovery never become economically viable at sufficient scale. Industrial output reaches higher peaks than in other scenarios, but this apparent success is temporary and ultimately counterproductive. Here's how the collapse unfolds. Environmental degradation reduces agricultural productivity, leading to food shortages. Wealthy nations experience declining birth rates as economic pressures make family formation more difficult. Poor nations experience famines and social unrest. The shortage of young workers reduces industrial capacity just when aging populations need more resources. Meanwhile, easily accessible natural resources become depleted, further constraining economic activity. The result is a cascading failure across multiple systems simultaneously. It's not just economic recession or environmental crisis or social upheaval. It's all three reinforcing each other in a downward spiral that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. When MIT published their study 50 years ago, this business-as-usual scenario was presented as one possibility among several. Today, however, recent analysis suggests this catastrophic pathway most closely matches our actual trajectory. The KPMG reality check fast forward to 2021, when sustainability researcher Gaia Harrington decided to check how accurately the original MIT predictions had tracked reality over the past 50 years. Working with the consulting firm KPMG, Harrington compared real-world data on population, industrial output, food production, resource consumption, and pollution levels against the various scenarios modeled by World 3. Her findings were sobering. The comprehensive technology scenario, the one requiring breakthrough innovations to save us, showed the poorest fit with actual historical data. The stabilized world scenario, the one requiring deliberate policy changes towards sustainability, also diverged significantly from reality. Instead, real-world trends matched most closely with the business-as-usual scenario, the one predicting civilizational collapse around 2040. Even more concerning, Harrington found that several key indicators were ahead of schedule compared to the original predictions. We're consuming resources faster, producing more pollution, and approaching various tipping points more quickly than the MIT model anticipated 50 years ago. This doesn't mean collapse is inevitable. Computer models are tools for understanding trends, not crystal balls for predicting fate. But it does suggest that we're currently on a trajectory that has historically led to civilizational breakdown, and we're moving along that trajectory faster than originally expected. The mechanics of modern collapse. To understand how a modern collapse might unfold, we need to appreciate how different our situation is from civilizations of the past. Previous empires were largely self-contained. When Rome fell, life in China continued largely unaffected. When the Maya abandoned their cities, European societies carried on without disruption. Our global civilization operates more like a single integrated machine. Supply chains stretch across multiple continents. Financial systems connect markets in real time across all time zones. Critical infrastructure, power grids, internet networks, transportation systems crosses national boundaries and depends on international cooperation. This integration creates efficiency and resilience in normal times, but potentially catastrophic vulnerability during crises. Consider what happened during the early stages of the COVID pandemic. A health crisis that started in one region quickly disrupted manufacturing in Asia, shipping routes through major ports, and consumer behavior across North America and Europe simultaneously. Now imagine similar disruptions affecting food production, energy supplies, or financial systems. A collapse in one area could trigger cascading failures across multiple sectors and regions with unprecedented speed. The MIT model suggests this cascade might begin with environmental pressures on food production. Climate change, soil degradation, water scarcity, and pollution could combine to reduce agricultural yields just as global population peaks. Unlike previous famines that affected specific regions, modern agriculture is global. Disruptions in major grain-producing regions affect food prices everywhere. Food insecurity leads to social instability, which disrupts economic activity, which reduces resources available for environmental protection, which accelerates environmental degradation, which further threatens food production. Meanwhile, an aging global population requires increasing resources for healthcare and social support, just as working-age populations in many developed countries begin declining. The financial implications alone are staggering. Modern economies depend on continuous growth to service debt, fund pensions, and maintain social services. A sustained period of economic contraction, especially if triggered by resource constraints rather than cyclical factors, could destabilize financial systems that assume perpetual expansion. But perhaps most significantly, modern civilization depends on extraordinarily complex knowledge systems that could be vulnerable to disruption. Your smartphone requires materials from dozens of countries, manufacturing processes involving thousands of specialized steps, and software developed by teams of highly educated engineers. If the global systems supporting this complexity were disrupted, rebuilding them might prove extremely difficult. The innovation wildcard critics of the MIT study point out one potentially crucial flaw in the modeling. It may underestimate humanity's capacity for innovation under pressure. Throughout history, some of our greatest technological breakthroughs have emerged from existential challenges. World War II accelerated developments in computing, radar, jet engines, and nuclear energy. The oil crises of the 1970s spurred innovations in energy efficiency and alternative energy sources. This perspective suggests that as resource constraints and environmental pressures intensify, market forces and human ingenuity will naturally shift toward developing solutions. We're already seeing early signs of this in the rapid growth of renewable energy technologies, advances in battery storage, development of alternative proteins, and increasing investment in recycling and circular economy approaches. The question is whether this innovation can happen fast enough and at sufficient scale to avoid the worst-case scenarios modeled by World 3. It's like asking whether we can invent and deploy parachutes while already falling from an airplane, technically possible, but requiring extraordinary speed and coordination. Some promising developments suggest reason for optimism. Solar and wind power have become the cheapest sources of electricity in most markets. Electric vehicles are approaching price parity with conventional cars. Advances in artificial intelligence and automation could dramatically improve resource efficiency across many sectors. But other challenges seem more intractable. We still lack economically viable technologies for large-scale carbon removal from the atmosphere. Plastic pollution continues accumulating in oceans and ecosystems. Soil degradation and groundwater depletion threaten agricultural productivity in key regions. And perhaps most fundamentally, our economic systems still depend on continuous material growth that may be incompatible with planetary boundaries. The social dimension, one aspect that the original MIT study couldn't fully capture, was the social and political dimensions of potential collapse scenarios. Computer models can track resource flows and economic indicators, but they struggle to account for human behavior, social cohesion, and political responses to crisis. History suggests that societies facing resource constraints often respond in ways that accelerate rather than mitigate their problems. Competition for scarce resources can lead to conflict rather than cooperation. Political systems may prioritize short-term stability over long-term sustainability. Wealthy groups might insulate themselves from consequences while problems concentrate among more vulnerable populations. We can already observe some of these dynamics emerging. Climate change impacts are disproportionately affecting poorer regions and populations, while wealthy countries and individuals have greater capacity to adapt. Political polarization in many democracies makes coordinated responses to long-term challenges increasingly difficult. International cooperation on global issues like climate change has proven frustratingly slow despite widespread scientific consensus. On the other hand, human societies have also demonstrated remarkable capacity for cooperation and adaptation when facing existential threats. The global response to ozone depletion in the 1980s showed that international coordination on environmental issues is possible when the stakes are clear and the solutions are feasible. The question is whether our social and political systems can evolve quickly enough to address challenges that operate on longer timescales and require more fundamental changes than previous environmental problems. Economic implications and paradigm shifts. If the MIT analysis proves accurate, the economic implications would be profound and far-reaching. Our current economic models assume continuous growth, expanding markets, and increasing resource throughput. Financial systems, from individual retirement planning to government debt structures, depend on expectations of future expansion. A transition to steady state or declining material throughput would require fundamental restructuring of these systems. How do you maintain living standards while reducing resource consumption? How do you service debt in a non-growing economy? How do you provide for aging populations with smaller workforces? Some economists argue this transition is not only possible but necessary for long-term prosperity. They envision economies focused more on services, information, and quality improvements rather than raw material growth. Think of how the music industry transformed from physical records to digital streaming, dramatically reducing material requirements while potentially improving consumer experience. But such transitions require careful management and probably can't happen automatically through market forces alone. They would likely require new forms of economic measurement beyond gross domestic product, different approaches to monetary policy, and social safety nets designed for steady state rather than growth economies. The challenge is that making these transitions voluntarily, while we still have options and resources, would be far easier than being forced into them by crisis conditions. What the future might hold, so where does this leave us? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain what the next 20 years will bring. The MIT study and its recent validation provide important warnings about current trends, but they don't guarantee specific outcomes. What we can say is that the next 2 decades will likely be pivotal for human civilization. We're approaching multiple tipping points simultaneously: environmental, economic, demographic, and technological. The decisions we make collectively during this period will probably determine whether we experience managed transition to more sustainable systems or chaotic breakdown of current arrangements. The optimistic scenario involves rapid deployment of clean technologies, fundamental reforms to economic systems, and unprecedented international cooperation on global challenges. We develop the tools and institutions needed for prosperity within planetary boundaries before resource constraints force the issue. The pessimistic scenario involves continued business as usual until environmental and resource pressures trigger cascading failures across multiple systems. By the time the need for change becomes undeniable, our options have become much more limited and costly. Most likely, we'll experience elements of both significant disruptions and challenges, but also remarkable innovations and adaptations. The question is whether the innovations can outpace the disruptions, and whether we can manage the transition smoothly enough to preserve the benefits of modern civilization while addressing its unsustainable aspects. Personal and collective responses, understanding these large-scale trends, raises natural questions about how individuals and communities should respond. Should we be learning survivalist skills and stockpiling supplies? Should we be pursuing careers in sustainable technologies? Should we be moving to regions less vulnerable to environmental disruption? The honest answer is that personal preparations, while potentially useful, are probably less important than collective actions. The challenges identified by the MIT study operate at scales that can only be addressed through coordinated social, economic, and political responses. That said, developing resilience, both personal and community level, seems prudent regardless of specific future scenarios. This might involve reducing personal resource consumption, developing practical skills, building social connections, and supporting political candidates and policies that take long-term challenges seriously. More fundamentally, it involves recognizing that the next 20 years will probably require more conscious choices about how we organize our societies and economies. The automatic assumptions of continuous growth and expanding consumption that guided the past century may no longer serve us well going forward. The choice before us. The MIT study and its recent validation force us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that our current trajectory may not be sustainable, and that the window for smooth transitions to more sustainable systems may be closing faster than we realized. This doesn't mean collapse is inevitable. Computer models are analytical tools, not prophetic visions. Human societies have repeatedly demonstrated capacity for remarkable adaptations when facing existential challenges. The same ingenuity that created our current predicament could potentially solve it. But it does mean that the choices we make during the next decade, as individuals, communities, nations, and species, will probably be more consequential than those made by any previous generation. We're living through a historical inflection point that will likely determine the trajectory of human civilization for centuries to come. The researchers who created World 3 50 years ago weren't trying to predict doom. They were trying to provide early warning systems that might help us navigate toward better outcomes. Their work suggests we still have time to change course, but perhaps not as much time as we might wish. Whether their warnings prove prophetic or merely historically interesting depends largely on what we do next. The future, as always, remains unwritten, but it's being shaped by the choices we're making right now. Thanks for joining me on EconoSphere for this deep dive into one of the most important economic studies of our time. What do you think about these projections? Are you optimistic that human innovation can solve these challenges in time? Or concerned that we're headed toward the business-as-usual scenario? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more analysis of the economic forces shaping our world. Until next time, keep thinking critically about the systems that shape our lives, because understanding them might be the first step toward improving them.